Welcome to a dialogue on accountability in the digital age. A dialogue with representatives of a global, multi-stakeholder community.
And I'm your host, Firth Butterfield, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Firth Butterfield. Kay, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Allow me to introduce Kay. You are a true Renaissance woman, a barrister, former judge, professor, technologist, entrepreneur, and one of the foremost experts in the world on the governance of artificial intelligence. You're a member of the Executive Committee of the World Economic Forum, co-founded Global AI, and was also the world's first AI ethics officer. There's a lot more on that list, but before we have a discussion, also awards and honors, including Forbes Women Defining the 21st Century AI Movement, and the New York Times, who recognize you as the 10 women changing the landscape of leadership. Again, Kay, honored and a pleasure to have you. And we're going to talk about AI and ethics.
Super, my favorite topic.
Good. Hey, so to begin with, World Economic Forum, AI, how did that come together? How did you start your journey in AI and how did ethics get involved?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose you may know that I was a lawyer, a human rights lawyer to begin with. And I'd written books and was writing a book one day on human rights and human trafficking. Okay. And I started thinking about would we abuse humans if there were robots for us to abuse? And so it was very much a thought piece. And that turned into me really sort of thinking more about artificial intelligence and where it was at that time. So that would have been 2010, I think. And really beginning to dive into the two big places that I think we still are not paying enough attention with AI and ethics, or a responsible AI, whatever term you want to give it. And that is, what is its impact in geopolitical terms? So I have a master's degree in AI and international relations. And what is the legal impact? What's the impact of the way that we use AI on the laws that we have and the laws that we should have? And so once I was doing that, I managed to sit on a plane next to the chair and CEO of a startup called Lucid AI. It was 1 week after Stephen Hawking and Stuart Russell and Max Tegmark had written that piece in the Times of London, saying that AI might be the best thing that humanity ever does, or it might be our last. And this poor guy was thinking about his impact as he brought AI into the world. And we had 10 hours on a plane. And as we got off, he asked me if I'd go and work for him. So I actually came up with this terrible title, Chief AI Ethics Officer, because I think the problem with using the word ethics is that it brings everybody to, well, whose ethics are we going to use and all of that sort of thing. Whereas now sort of using responsible AI or trustworthy AI, I think avoids that particular problem. So I then, I went from there to starting what is now the Responsible AI Institute, which looks at certification of AI, and then to lead the work at the World Economic Forum on, in those days, just governance with a small g of AI. But now we look at building applications for humanitarian purposes, and much more thinking about how business uses AI and how it should use it responsibly or in a trustworthy fashion.
Okay, good. That's because was one of my questions. What is the World Economic Forum doing with AI? Could you
Sure.
dive into, a little bit into that?
Yeah, I could.
Yeah.
Might take up our whole time because
Okay.
we've been doing it since 2017. And we started by creating, we don't write white papers. We only create frameworks and models for people to actually use. So, for example, in the responsible AI bracket, we created a toolkit for boards. It's online, it's interoperable across devices. And what we know is that many boards are older gentlemen who don't necessarily have technical skills. And so what we wanted to do was to give them a toolkit that they could look at and understand what their duties and as oversight for companies as more and more of them use AI. And then we followed that up with this year published a toolkit for the C-suite. So if you're the chief human resources officer, you should know that there's some law coming from Europe. There's law in the US. There's the EEOC waiting to find the right case to prosecute because you've used AI in that human resources area, and you've used it unwisely without doing due diligence. And so for each of the C-suite roles, we've mapped out what you really need to know about AI and what you should be thinking about. So that's sort of governance in companies. There's a whole lot of other things, but as I say, I can't take up our whole time talking about them. Then there's thinking about governments and how governments should think about using AI. So our very first project is, well, if you're going to use AI, you're either going to make it or you're going to procure it. Most governments are actually procuring it.
Okay.
They can use procurement of AI as a form of soft governance, because if you set standards for what you want to buy, then that's actually a form of soft governance in AI. And so we did that. We started the work with the UK, but we aren't consultants. So the idea of anything is that we do work with a multi-stakeholder group. So that's always academics, government, nonprofits, and business. And then we produce something which hopefully is adopted widely. So the UK adopted it in 2020. It's also in force in Bahrain and the UAE, and also now in Brazil. And we're just beginning to talk to Japan about using the tools that we created. Then in the applications space, chatbots. How do you use chatbots responsibly if you're going to use them in healthcare? So we created, again, a framework of how to do that with that multi-stakeholder group. And that's now being piloted in Rwanda. And so then I'll just very briefly talk about two others. One is facial recognition and use by law enforcement. It's such an important topic. And I'm pleased to say that actually the Dutch police have been working with us on piloting a framework that we developed with Interpol and Unicry to really dig down into what's responsible use of facial recognition by law enforcement. And then finally, just the humanitarian piece. We have just developed a tool which we are piloting this week for the first time, which we hope will be able to predict where wildfires are going to occur in Turkey, and will then and then there'll be a second tool to help firefighters, etc., understand which one they might want to go to. So if we can do that in Turkey, we can then hopefully encourage governments across Mediterranean that have Mediterranean climates to also use the tool. And one thing that a lot of people don't know is that the fires in California last year the amount of emissions undid all the work that they have been doing over the last 10 years on climate change. And so this, if we can do it, this is a significant step to improving the state of the world.
So many great examples from all parts of the world using AI. First question is actually coming back to what you first said. Which ethical framework are you using? Because it's a global standard, a global standard. Which do you use?
Yeah, so we don't specifically say we are using an ethical standard. What we did do is we talked to PwC, who had done a lot of work on saying, you know, which standards, which principles are common across the globe. And they came up with 9, maybe 10 that were common across the globe. So everybody, it turns out, would like some explainability, some accountability, would like AI to be beneficial for humanity, would like privacy. And so really we used those as the backbone for the way we think about these tools that we create. But the key is that we are not trying to dictate to anybody how they should think and what their ethics should be. We're creating tools which then they can use, if they choose to do better when they're thinking about how to use chatbots with healthcare, or chatbots in any situation. You could take the framework and you could use it in any situation. But what we wanted to do, you know, there's so much talk about principles to practice. We've been doing that for the last 5 years. We've been trying to give people practical guides to work with.
I got that. Now, does bring me the question, which is, okay, well, it needs to be accountable, it needs to be explainable. What's then the definition of explainable? What's then the definition of accountable? And is there room to maneuver in that definition across different organizations across the world?
Absolutely. And you know, frankly, there is likely to be forever, because we are not going to have global law on this. I just don't see us having global law. I see us perhaps through GPay and the work that we do at the forum, and the work that we do with UNESCO and UNICEF and UNICRI and the OECD, as some countries coming to some understanding of what responsible or trustworthy AI looks like, and having similar laws. I do think that there is a possibility for the new European Act on AI to have the same influence that GDPR had, for example. And if you look across the world, certainly the areas that we're working in, you do see some sort of harmonization or similarity, not harmonization, similarity of the laws that are growing in those countries. But you know, we can't expect to have the same ethical parameters across the world, and we can't expect to enforce the ones that we believe in on anybody else. I think that that's a fallacious argument. And the best we can do is hope that everybody adopts some law, something around explainability or accountability. But, you know, we're not really seeing that. And you could say that it's not an AI, it's not just relevant to applicable to AI. Actually, there are divisions in our world that are geopolitical divisions, and AI is just one of the aspects that is caught in this web of differation between us.
We are focusing on artificial intelligence. I mean, given your background, but it's a question which goes beyond AI. It is applicable to a lot of digital technology being developed out there. We have to understand how we're going to govern that. And maybe AI is just leading the wave and leading the way how we're going to do that. Because for blockchain, quantum, we're going to have to do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on quantum, I can tell you that we created the first principles for responsible quantum just this year. So
Great.
what we wanted to do, we realized that we're way behind with AI. We wanted to actually try and be at the beginning for quantum.
Great. Now okay, that's good to know. We'll definitely make that available when we send out the video, the interview. Now, I don't know if you're capable to answer the following question, but in general, do governments, do international institutes understand AI enough to understand what the impact is of AI on this world?
I'd like to say yes. I think that there are extremely hardworking people in almost every government who do understand the impact of AI and do want to do it correctly. I talk to a lot of them all the time. The problem, I think, is more at the level of politicians, where the politicians don't really understand the impact of AI. And it's the politicians in many countries that need to be first movers in terms of actually creating any legislation, if that's the way we want to go. I think there's a separate debate that we could have about whether we want regulation or whether we want soft governance. But to your question, I think there are people who understand it and could try and do a good job, but our politicians don't on the whole understand it, and don't understand. The thing that's most important, I think, here is that they don't understand that AI will be everywhere, and it will be everywhere in our private lives, in our public lives, in our business lives. And we need to prepare a world for that. And, you know, when we add in the metaverse, if that's bigger, which is simply an application of AI, then, you know, we could all be living in that and working in it.
This reminds you a little bit of, actually reminds me of a discussion I had with Newt Gingrich when he was in The Hague a couple of years ago. And asked him, sir, could you give me your view on how to deal with accountability in the digital age? Now, he's also a lawyer by background. And he said, well, it's just like any other innovation out there. Look at how we invented a car 100 years ago. Initially, we had somebody walking in front of the car when it passed the town with a red flag. And it took us about 10, 20 years to write up the laws we need to and regulate traffic. Now, I was in a room with 150 people. About 100 said, hey, yeah, I understand the concept, I understand the principle. But there were about 50 who I would say were a little bit more digital technology savvy and said, hey, in principle, I understand that answer, I understand that approach, but what you're missing is time.
Yeah.
Do we have the time to wait 10, 20 years? So that's my first question. I think we've already answered that question. But then my follow-up question to you is this accountability in a digital age a 21st century issue which requires 21st century solutions? In other words, should we still be looking at rules, regulation, law to govern technology, or should we be looking at 21st century solutions? What's your take on that?
Okay, so first of all, on the time, absolutely not. Resounding no, we don't have 20 years to wait. Our world will look totally different in 20 years, and not just because of AI. On the second point, you know, should we be looking at 21st century solutions? Of course we should. But I don't think that means that all law needs to be dead. I mean, obviously, I am a lawyer, so I may have a bias here.
Yeah.
But I'm a common law lawyer, and one of the things that we pride ourselves in doing is understanding how society is changing and extending and changing law for how society has changed, with notable exceptions just recently in America. But let's move to the concept of common law was always that you saw what the law was, and then you saw where it needed to move, and within parameters you were able to have that flexibility. So I think that there is room for law. I think it's going to be really interesting how the European AI Act is actually implemented, because I think at the moment it's really hard to see how it's going to be implemented. But one of my problems with law is that it takes forever. I mean, a case can take forever. So supposing there was law in place today, it can take years to actually have an action tried, and then you've got the various levels of appeal as well. So it can take a long time. So you could be talking about 5 years before we actually have any case law. So that then suggests to me, which is what I said earlier, that we need to find creative, soft governance, 21st century ways of creating governance. And part of that, which I think is very exciting, is that we are seeing companies begin to see their role as stewards, with ESG. Mm-hmm. And I personally think that technology, AI in my case, actually fits in E, S, and G, because it needs all three.
And tying into that, I also see a shift. Now, I'm not a lawyer by background, an engineer, but what I can follow is a shift from rule-based thinking into principle-based thinking, which allows us a little bit more freedom in interpreting what was actually meant and what was the idea, the rationale behind thinking about that particular law, rather than does it apply or not. Could be part of the solution here. Now, you were the first ethical AI officer in the world. Is that the same as taking a human-centric approach?
I think it is. I mean, other people might say differently, but for me, taking a human-centric approach is truly important. And when I talk about human-centric, I don't forget the planet, because we humans won't do very well without our planet. And so it's that symbiotic relationship when I think about human-centered. I can't actually see any point for AI if it doesn't help us, serve us, be controlled by us. The other seems to me a truly dystopian world.
Okay, this is actually a very nice segue to my final topic for today's dialogue, Kay, and that is coming back to, you already mentioned him, Stephen Hawking. Now, he predicted that the way AI is evolving could spell the end of the human race. Now, that's his prediction a couple of years ago. But I was reminded by that when I saw two recent news articles came out. First of all, there was an AI bot which wrote a scientific paper on itself. So where the researcher behind the experiment really says she didn't hope she opened the Pandora's box. And there also are some recent decisions from South Africa and Australia that artificial intelligence can be listed as an inventor of a patent. What's your thoughts? Should we go down that route?
Well, let me first talk about the AI bot that wrote its own scientific paper. I mean, I think that what we are seeing is the gradual development of a form of artificial general intelligence. We may not see it, it may not be artificial general intelligence, but it is a development that's possibly a bit beyond the narrow. So let me talk about AlphaCode, for example. AlphaCode can pass can pass questions and can then work out how to answer them. And it can do it better than 56% of coders who are in the same competition. That's to me an interesting development. I don't see that as wiping out humanity, in terms of Hawkins, it's dangerous. I do see it as a reason that we need to get on with thinking about how AI and humans are going to work together. And then there's should AI be an inventor? My very first piece of work when I got to the forum was on this topic. It's precisely because I believe that we should not be allowing AI to invent things, because that actually gives the first movers huge power. If you think about it, if you're a company that's already an AI company and your AI can now invent things, you are in a huge advantage above every other company in the world. That's number one. Secondly, should the AI have its own legal identity? Absolutely not. Because at the moment, there are people creating these algorithms that then are going on to do X. It's the people who create them that should be creating them with a diverse team, with guardrails in place at the time of creation, and should watch for it as it goes through the various development segments, and in many cases after sale. And that's the sort of regime that we need, either voluntarily or through some form of regulation, to see in companies all over the world as we use more and more AI.
Okay, so last question. Are you optimistic or cautious or pessimistic the future of AI and it being responsible AI?
I think to work in AI at all, you have to be optimistic that that we are going to be creating something that really helps with the major problems that we have in the world, like our wildfire prediction tool. I am pleased that we're now at the point where responsible AI is being discussed, because it wasn't for a long time. I am optimistic that if we keep talking about responsible AI and the need for it, the companies that are being told to just go and get AI or they'll die actually understand that you have to get responsible AI, because otherwise you buy more problems than you solve.
Well, that's the core, I'd say, objective of our Institute for Accountability in the Digital Age, making certain that we begin by talking about it, then hopefully the solutions will find itself. And you've given us an insight in the great work which the World Economic Forum is doing in this case, and also why we're doing it. And yeah, I'm going to follow this.
Well, it was a great pleasure to have the opportunity of talking to you. Thanks for inviting me.